Good morning, everyone. As it is now 11:07, I apologize for the delay in starting the meeting, but I think we're good to go. We're going to call the meeting of the CMAQ, CRP, and TAPAL Project Selection Committee to order. For those online, we apologize. We don't have the camera working, but you should be able to see the slides and hear the audio. So with that, my name is Doug Ferguson. I am the chair of the committee. If we could go around the room and just introduce ourselves. Grant?
Yeah, Grant Davis from CDOT.
Mark Pitstick, RTA, representing transit agencies.
John Paul Deepla, FHWA.
Dave Brady, Village of Bedford Park, Southwest Council of Mayors.
Tara Orban, sitting in for Tom Rickert, representing counties.
Christopher Schmidt, Illinois Department of Transportation.
All right, thank you. So we don't have any agenda changes or announcements. Are there any announcements from committee members? All right, seeing none, let's move on to 3.0, approval of the minutes. Included in your meeting materials are the minutes from the July 18th meeting. Staff has already identified one change. John Paul Deepla from FHWA will be added as in attendance at the meeting. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes from July 18th with the aforementioned change?
So moved.
Thank you. Do I have a second? Thank you. Are there any other changes that are needed for the minutes that anybody noticed? All right, seeing none. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, minutes passed. Under 4.0 program monitoring, we have a few items here today. First is the programming status sheets for all three programs. This is just for information purposes. Are there any questions on the sheets as presented?
Yes, I had just a question.
Go ahead.
So this is on the FFY 24 through 28 CMAQ program summary.
Yeah.
On the unobligated balance, I saw there was funding for 2024 for State Lake and also the wireless signal interconnects. I'm wondering, I think those are actually obligated.
Yes, it's always unusual when we transfer the funds, what's considered obligated by FHWA versus if it's actually in an approved grant at FTA. And so sometimes we have to show things.
Okay, so you're waiting for it to be in the approved grants.
Grant, yes.
Okay, that's where
I believe that's what's going on there.
Okay.
Until it's in an approved grant, FTA doesn't consider it obligated, even though it's come off the FHWA's FEMA's balance.
That's where I was getting confused.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, not a problem.
You bring up a good point, Grant. I had the same question.
All right, if there's no other questions, we'll move on to 4.02, the CMAQ programming summary and obligation goal. Obligations have gone up a little bit since our last meeting. So far this year, we've obligated 87 million, which is still short of our annual appropriation by roughly 35 million. And we have 67 million that's sitting in advanced construction status right now. Staff continues to monitor the progress of the projects, but it's unlikely that we're going to exceed the annual appropriation amount or spend down and on the unobligated balance. With that, do committee members have any questions on the obligation goal report? All right, seeing none. 4.3, the CMAQ program midpoint performance plan. Federal performance target regulations require that CMAQ establish and monitor performance measures that are associated with the CMAQ program. In 2018, CMAQ established a 2- and 4-year target for the first performance period with the adoption of ONTO 2050. With the adoption of the ONTO 2050 update in October 12th, 2022, CMAQ established new 2- and 4-year targets. This draft report is included in your materials for the purposes of showing the 2-year progress assessment for the midpoint of the performance plan. The performance measures that are included are peak hour excessive delay, non-single occupancy vehicle travel, and then also total emissions reduction. So this is how we've done in those different areas. For the peak hour excessive delay, we're showing 11.6 hours of delay, which is below the 2-year target of 15.6. So lower is better in this case. It means less hours of peak hour excessive delay. Any questions on this target? I should add this target and the non-SOV target are both set in conjunction with our partners at NERC. Both NDOT and IDOT were consulted in the development of this target and the assessment.
Just kind of curious, like, how does this compare to other regions throughout the, like, are we seeing this kind of reduction across the United States due to COVID, like COVID or?
Yeah, during the COVID period, there definitely was a reduction and then we saw an increase, but it didn't increase at the same rate it was previously going. The targets were set on a based upon a increasing line for peak hour excessive delay for both on the state as a whole, but also here in this region. But we haven't seen things resume quite to the same extent they were prior to COVID. As far as we haven't really looked at and compared ourselves to how we're doing compared to other areas that have to do this measurement as well. But I think that's something we could do.
I was just curious.
Okay. Any other questions?
And so when we do the report, they're gonna ask, you know, why the number is as low as it is, or what do we attribute that to? And I mean, you just sort of went through it a bit now, but, and it has a little bit in your narrative, but.
You can tell FHWA, and I'm looking at my partner right at the end of the table. This is a measurement on the NHS system. Very little of CMAQ money is actually spent on the NHS system. So the factors that go into congestion on the NHS system well exceed the powers of CMAQ and the money that we are given. We could probably spend $1 billion of CMAQ and probably not see the needle move based upon the CMAQ funds. We don't have a way of saying like, was the cause of the reduction based upon CMAQ funded projects or not?
I'm almost willing to say you probably couldn't see that being a factor for most of these. I mean, maybe the emissions.
Well, we'll get to emissions in a second, and non-SOV, we do know why non-SOV, because we can target, it's based upon work from home numbers. And yeah.
I guess just selfishly, I mean, the numbers are what they are, but just saying that I know that's going to be a question that's going to be asked in the reporting, and just, if that's the answer, that's the answer. I just wanted to make sure that was something you guys were, because it seems like every 2 years I kind of forget what goes into that reporting.
Well, so it's the results are the target is set and the measurement is through the RITIS system. And so, I mean, and that's just collecting data and processing it. Whether like, I mean.
And I'll admit, I'm just the messenger. I'm not saying that it's a good idea or that it's something that can be answered from your perspective. And you just brought up a good point about where the CMAQ funds go and what their the contribution are to the NHS. But I just felt I had to say that.
I know, it just like our region is large enough. And I mean, congestion is so prevalent, like what causes, I mean, like it took a pandemic to really see like a major reduction in congestion in our region. CMAQ is not going to cause that to happen.
Yeah.
To that level.
Most definitely. Thank you.
But we can try to put something more together if you think it's needed, but we're gonna be guessing. I don't know how we're supposed to tie in a CMAQ project with like peak hour excessive delay.
I'm not saying that there's a right answer either. I'm just
Okay.
saying that the question will be asked and there'll be a blank that will need to be filled. And I can get as creative as possible, but having your input and the MPO's input in that narrative is obviously important because you set the targets and we just sort of agree with them. And I mean, I can say the same thing that you said. I just want to make sure that it's in lockstep with the way it would want to be read.
I
in a
mean,
Public's facing report should or when that be,
at this point in time, I mean, like, we have followed the guidance from FHWA as far as what the report needs to include. And we've done that.
Yeah.
Um, Okay.
I think we're going back and forth on the same, it doesn't.
Okay,
We can lean on the keyboard and put that in there, Doug. I'm just trying to say that
Okay.
it's something's gonna have to go into the system about it, and I think we spent too much time on it already, so, thank you.
so for the next one, the non-SOV travel, we're showing, a 36.3% of work trips are made, by non-SOV modes. As I mentioned, this includes work from home. And, we have, exceeded our target, which was 32.4 for 2 year. We've actually exceeded the 4-year target. These targets, non-SOV targets, were created based upon the recommendation of Onto 2050 and seeing doubling in transit ridership in the region. But as I mentioned, based upon the census data that is used for this, for setting the target and the measurement, it really comes down to work from home drastically increased during the pandemic and stayed up post-pandemic. On the next slide, for total emissions reduction, we have 2 ozone precursors that we have to set targets for, which are volatile organic compounds and nitric oxides. For VOC, we are reporting 182 kilograms per day of emissions reduction, which is roughly 87% of our 2-year target. And for NOx, we didn't do as well. We're reporting 702 kilograms per day versus a target of 11,102 kilograms per day. There are a couple of reasons for not meeting the target, but most of it has to do with how we set the target. So we look at all the projects that we have programmed over 5 years. And when we did this, that was 2022 to 2026. And added up the estimated emissions benefit and then divided that by 5 to create an annual estimate, which we then use to create the 2 and 4-year target. If a project or projects with large estimated emissions benefit didn't obligate their first phase of CMAQ funding, then their emissions aren't counted here. So we did not see any diesel specific projects obligate funds during this 2-year time period, which probably accounts for why NOx is so far behind, since nitric oxides, diesel is a prime emitter of those nitric oxides. So our hope is that over the next 2 years, projects going forward will include projects that are diesel specific, and we will take a jump. You may remember in the first performance period, we had a large metro project for locomotives. That project was obligated early on, and we met all of our performance targets, both the 2-year and 4-year, before we even got to the 4-year, based upon that one project. It was just so massive as far as the emissions benefit is concerned. But most projects, say a bicycle facility project or signal interconnect, the portion, the amount estimated for those projects is much smaller. And so if those are the ones that are going and not the bigger diesel and projects, that's why we see what we do. So with that, are there any questions on the total emissions reduction? Yes, Chris.
Me again. So with that being said, are you seeing, or would we potentially see a prioritization or a bit of a prioritization for those types of projects because we have this data and we have that a target that FHWA seems to find value in? I know that CMAP with this program has different targets that are important, safety and things of that nature. But being that this is something that the feds, where the money comes from, is prioritizing, is that something that we could potentially see, maybe not this next round, but
Well, I mean, seeing as those projects, like 50% of a score for CMAQ is based upon the emissions benefit. So I think we've already prioritized those projects through that process. I don't know if like saying like we're going to prioritize those projects. I think all the projects that are available to us are prioritized in one shape or form.
okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and I'm not advocating for it as much as just asking the question.
Yeah, I mean, outside of creating new projects that don't currently exist, I think we funded the projects that have come forward for CMAQ funding in that area. All right, with that, so this report was going to be turned into IDOT and then subsequently FHWA prior to October 1st. But you will notice that it's probably going to be discussed at the next Transportation Committee meeting and then also the MPO Policy Committee meeting. So with that, before I would add that if you have any other questions on the report, if you could get those to me in the next couple of weeks, that would be helpful. So, all right, moving on to 5.0 project changes. I'm going to turn it over to John Hasma.
Good morning, all. It's going to be pretty quick from my end this time around. We received 2 project change requests, both of those being a part of the CMAQ program. The first request is for the Pace Bus Stop Access Project sponsored by Niles, which is an RTA access to transit project. This project currently has $636,577 CMAQ programmed for construction in 2024. And the sponsors request an increase of $320,000 CMAQ for construction in 24. The request is coming as a result of higher than anticipated construction costs. And the project was on the January 2024 state letting, but bids were rejected. And the project is now slated to be relet on September 20th next month. The project was re-ranked among access to transit projects in the 2020 to 2024 program and remained the second ranked project out of 3 selected in its category. Staff's recommending approval of the requested cost increase of the $320,000 CMAQ for construction in 2024. And then the second request is for the Regional Transit Signal Priority Integration Plan, and that's sponsored by the RTA. The project was approved for 36 million CMAQ for implementation in 2012 and is now in an FTA grant. The RTA is requesting a scope change to include 7 additional TSP corridors to the project. And as promised from the last meeting, Mark, along with staff from CTA and CDOT, will be giving an update on the project. So I will hand it off to them for their presentation.
Yes, thanks, John. I'll just talk a little bit from here and then Angela's going to come up and give a presentation. If you could pull up the first slide though, the first map. Yeah, these are the corridors that are being requested, and Angela's going to talk a little bit more about those. These are corridors in the city of Chicago. Let's stay on this one for just a minute here. These are the corridors that have been funded and implemented or are being implemented through this program in the city. The first corridor that went in were the south portion of Ashland Avenue and the entire Western Avenue corridor. Those were done some time ago. In the suburbs, Pace has implemented a few years ago Milwaukee Avenue, most recently Dempster Street. They have also implemented TSP on a number of the other corridors. Are not fully, tested and accepted yet, but the equipment has been installed. And several corridors, they are waiting for IDOT permits on those. So those are like, I think, CMAQ Road and 159th Street, maybe one more. So most of the, we basically took the funding that was available, split it in half between CTA and CDOT side for the routes. Pace has now implemented or obligated all the funds on their side. CTA has been working more recently with CDOT on the north and central portions of Ashland Avenue. That's a different type of project though, because it requires traffic signal modernization, which is much more expensive, more construction involved. So they have a separate CMAQ grant to do that. So that grant is going to fund most of that project. And then, so once the bids come in for that project, the expectation is that there'll be substantial funding remaining on the CTA side of the ledger to do additional corridors. Now, when we applied for this program 12 years ago, there was a lot of other corridors that were in the application. Those corridors are not proposed to be moving forward at this time for various reasons, mostly because of the equipment, the status of the equipment, and they would require, again, a lot of traffic signal modernization and things like that that are more expensive and can't be done. So CTA and CDOT have proposed some additional corridors, the ones that I just showed you. You can go to the next slide for just a second. These are the proposed corridors to add to the list, and this is going to be done instead of the other corridors that were approved 12 years ago. So Angela, with assistance from Matt Pitts of CDOT, is going to talk through sort of how they got to these corridors and what the proposal is and how this would be accomplished. So, thanks, Angela.
Hello all, I'm Angela. I'm a senior project manager in the Planning and Innovation Department at CTA. So yes, I'll go over TSP and how things are going a little bit, and then yes, our new proposed corridors. So next slide. Go ahead. So again, TSP, I think most of you all know about it, but in case you don't, transit signal priority, putting equipment at the intersections to help speed up our buses with an extended green light, short and red. Again, providing consistent, reliable bus service with also consistent, reliable bus to rail connection. So as Mark said, we currently have it in place on a couple corridors already, and we are expanding, certainly, again, following up on Ashland and finishing up that corridor. But yes, we've had close collaboration with CDOT, in addition to obviously with RTA and PACE, and having interoperability be certainly a priority, but also understanding the status of where we are with our intersections, with the equipment, with our bandwidth of which, prioritizing the routes that would service the riders most here in the city. Next slide. So current network, we have Western, South Ashland, and Jeffrey. Jeffrey was started it off, not part of CMAQ grants. Still going strong with the 7 intersections there. And then the other 2, Western and South Ashland, were all funded design and implementation under the CMAQ grant by RTA. So far, I'm troubleshooting, they're being maintained, but the equipment is old. So we certainly want to replace equipment that is there on Western and South Ashland, the equipment that's out in the field. As far as our buses and the routers, that's another story, but that's working just fine. So those corridors would be, in a sense, already part of this of replacing equipment. Next slide. So with our ongoing TSP, so as mentioned, North Central Ashland construction will start in 2025. This one is very different from Western and South Ashland, as we need to have traffic signal modernization. There's a lot more construction, pavement. So this one is just higher effort than the other intersections that had TSP on the previous corridor sections. And so, yeah, working closely with CDOT on getting that. So we have final design. Right now, CDOT will do the procurement. And as we mentioned, that's CTA CMAQ grant funds will pay for that construction piece. Centralized TSP. So this one, CDOT is the grantee. And this is through ATC MTD or an ATTAIN grant. So with this, we are focused on Broadway Sheridan, Roosevelt, and Stony Island. We've, CDOT has already selected a consultant, just doing some formal sign work with the federal government. But hopefully we will be able to start on that, by the end of this year, early next year, on this project. So these corridors are already, slated to have TSP. But the reason why we chose those is because they already have the latest and greatest equipment in the field right now. Next slide. So why we, the reason why we selected the corridors that Mark showed you on the map, and I'll show again, was that major construction work was not needed to modernize the equipment. So in the sense that I looked at the signal inventory of many corridors, and these were the corridors with the highest number of intersections that had generally a ATC controller. It had a good, cabinet, or if it has an outdated controller, the cabinet is good. So you didn't have to do more construction that would make it into a partial traffic signal modernization. You're ripping out sidewalk, you're doing cabinet foundation. So that just is extra effort, extra design, extra cost. So of course, with all of that means a shorter time frame to implement. And so we also have, the city has MyoVision, which is the traffic cameras, also a cellular modem. We're not working with fiber. We're not then having to work with OEMC or OPSA involvement, which they were involved with Western and South Ashland. So that's also a difference. Like I said, having the MyoVision equipment being interconnected, those intersections would be the highest priority. If they don't have MyoVision equipment, as I said, the traffic camera or the cellular modem, those are easy add-ons, and the city is already doing that. Every year they are implementing, or they're installing MyoVision cameras. So this map right now with all the green dots, just high level, is just to show how many already have MyoVision, which is about more than 400 and counting every year. So then the other addition is with these, updated intersections, then if we do change to centralized TSP, which that is the hope, but we're focused on those 3 main corridors under our centralized TSP project with those funds, that these would be an easy switch to go to centralized. As really centralized means you're not dealing with any equipment. So we would then remove a TSP access point from, and we don't have to maintain it, but the MyoVision being connected, having the ATC controllers, those are all pertinent to have a modernized intersection and to allow for TSP. And then again, talking about the heavy ridership corridors, in addition to the the heavy ridership corridors, in addition to overlapping with modernized or close to modernized intersections. So 5 of the top 15 are included. And then they also align, 4 of these corridors align with our Better Streets for Buses framework that CTA and CDOT work together, and that's going to be a long-term thing of promoting better bus service on various corridors. Next slide. So then the proposed are listed here: Cottage Grove, Halsted, Pulaski, Cicero, Belmont, Chicago, and Archer. Right now, we are showing the whole corridor, but it's not every intersection on every corridor. So the 5 of the top 15 are Chicago, of the ridership is Chicago, Halsted, Pulaski, Belmont, and Cottage Grove. So I've done a preliminary, review of how many intersections, but that needs to be refined as to, some of them have about 20 intersections along them, but they're not consecutive. It will be a little different than what we have set up for Western and Ashland. But we do know that, getting a bus through and signalized intersection faster, when it's stopped at a red light and we have far side stops, do prove very beneficial for our bus service. Yeah, I think that's it. So I will take any questions, and if there's anything about MyoVision or the intersections, my colleague Matt Pitts from CDOT can answer.
All right, thank you. Before we do take any questions or discussion, just want to make sure that we have two project change requests for your consideration today. The staff recommendation is approval for both of those. Do we have a motion on the table?
So moved.
Thank you, Chris. Can I have a second?
Second.
Thanks, Grant. All right. So is there any questions for Angela or Mark on the TSP corridor project? All right. Any questions on the Niles project? All right, hearing none. All those in favor? Any opposed? All right, the changes passed. Thank you. All right, moving on to the federal fiscal year 2026 to 2030 program development. So we are still moving ahead. Next slide, please. We've put together a draft calendar. You'll notice that October 21st is the opening for the call for projects, with applications due by December 20th. Staff, we should be roughly, some of the dates are a little squishy because we haven't figured out what the project selection committee dates for next year are going to be. So that's why some of them are just listing a month, but we anticipate having a draft program in April, and then it going out for a 30-day public comment period, and then coming back to this committee in May for this committee's approval, and then with final approval in June at the MPO Policy Committee meeting. So with that, we're going to bring up here in a second a scoring criteria change that we weren't anticipating having to make. I know we're bringing this kind of late, but I'll explain that for a second. But as far as the process and timeline, are there any questions on that? Yes, Mark.
Yes. Question. It seems like an accelerated time frame from what I recall, or did we do this?
We moved it up 3 months. And with the being that we're moving it away from the change in the federal fiscal year. So because the MPO Policy Committee only meets like June and then October, that we're kind of limited in that time frame. But this will allow projects to get into the program and start the process before the federal fiscal year and not after the federal fiscal year has already started.
Okay.
It also helps with staff. Changing the federal fiscal year is a busy time in the programming group, just with changing over and getting everything for a new adoption of the TIP. So this kind of helps us a little bit as well. We might be losing like 2 to 3 weeks in the whole scheme of things by doing it in this time frame. Any other questions? All right, so moving on to item 6.2, the Justice 40 disadvantaged community scoring. I don't know if everybody remembers, this was something new that we brought in the last call for projects. It was in addition to the inclusive growth scoring that we did. We put 10 points based upon FHWA's disadvantaged communities tool, or DAC tool. Since this time, the reason that we're bringing this forward is that we discovered that the DAC tool doesn't exist anymore. FHWA has moved to a new tool, and so we put together what we think is a good way to replace that scoring with some new scoring. So I'd like to call John Hadsma And are you going to do the sorry, Lee Scooby is going to do the presentation. But John, why don't you come up too, like, since you're going to be talking this through as well.
Hey, everybody. I'll get us started off here. My name is Lee Scooby. I am a planner in the planning division here at CMAQ, and I'm involved in our climate and transportation equity work. So I have been collaborating with John since the realization that the disadvantaged communities tool has been discontinued to figure out an alternative and also how we can align ourselves with the latest Department of Transportation equity guidance. So we'll get started on the next slide with a recap of what the last iteration's disadvantage scoring looked like. So communities, as I'm sure you know, were assigned up to 10 points based on the disadvantaged categories or burdens that the location of the project experiences. So projects that are located in census tracts that experience more categories of burden or disadvantage were allocated more points, as the table on the right there indicates. And so the intent of this is to target investments to the places in the region that are experiencing really high levels of disadvantage. And applicants were then asked to explain their answer, discussing how the project would address these burdens. And so on the next slide, like Doug mentioned, the tool that was previously used to do this no longer exists. And this creates an opportunity to align with the latest Department of Transportation guidance. So the latest Department of Transportation guidance is advising on how to comply with Justice 40, which I'm sure folks are familiar with, requiring that 40% of the benefits of federal investments go to communities that have been identified as low income and disadvantaged. And so the DOT is advising that projects are evaluated in compliance with this in a twofold way. So the first being benefits. How is the project going to benefit disadvantaged people living in the area? And the second focused on the burdens that the geography is currently experiencing. How is this project going to address those burdens? Very similar to what the DAC tool did before. And so on the next slide, you'll see our recommendation is to incorporate this benefits and burdens approach that the DOT is recommending using a newly developed tool called the Equitable Transportation Community Explorer, or ETC. And that has a lot of similarities to the previously used tool, but this one is particularly narrowed in on burdens that are related to transportation. So it's an interactive web application using 2020 census tracts and data. And it allows you, similar to the previous tool, to also see cumulative burdens that places are experiencing. So we can see not only the specific burdens, but how many, to start to understand more nuanced the way that burdens are being experienced by these geographies. And so the 5 components that the ETC allows us to look at are transportation and security, climate and disaster risk burden, environmental burden, health vulnerability, and social vulnerability. And so what we're proposing is that the ETC tool is used to answer 2 questions. The first is to identify the disadvantaged populations and groups that are living in the project area, and to describe how this project would benefit those disadvantaged groups. For example, you may learn from looking at the ETC tool that the project includes, or the project area has a high level of seniors, people with disabilities, and people who are unemployed. And so with that knowledge, the applicant can then describe how this project would benefit those disadvantaged populations. And the second piece of this is addressing the locational burdens. So identifying what the categories of disadvantaged are in the project and describing how the project will address those burdens. Very similar to the purpose of the DAC tool in the past, while adding some more nuance in this later iteration to also be addressing population groups. And so responses will be scored on the next slide, or responses would be scored using a high, medium, low scale. And this is a precedent that we've seen at other MPOs as well. High responses being those that clearly demonstrate how the project would address the burdens in the project area and benefit the disadvantaged populations. And importantly, this requires going beyond just identifying the disadvantages in the area and really asking the applicant to describe how this project would be addressing those disadvantages. And I'm going to pass it over to John to go more into depth on this scoring.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. And now that we have a foundation, and if we want to move on to the next slide, foundation of for how staff is proposing to structure the disadvantaged communities section. I'm going to go over the specifics of the 2 questions and how applicants will complete these prompts, as well as how staff will score these prompts. So again, for question 1, It would ask applicants to identify disadvantaged population groups who live in the location to be served by the project. To do that, the applicant will use the ETC tool to select the census tract where the project is located and to see what disadvantaged population groups are the most prevalent in the project area. Once those are identified, the applicant would explain how the project will provide benefits to those groups. Staff will review the responses and assign the high, medium, low scoring method that Lee had outlined. And high responses would receive 4 points, medium responses would receive 2 points, and low responses would receive 1 point. If we move on to the next slide for question 2, applicants would identify the categories of disadvantage in the location of the project for this question. And again, those 5 categories are climate, environment, health, social vulnerability, and transportation insecurity. Once the disadvantaged categories have been identified, applicants will need to demonstrate how the project that they are proposing will create benefits and positive outcomes and address the disadvantage burdens the community faces. To score this question, 2 elements will be considered. The first is assigning the high, medium, low method to each response, and that's at the top there on that table. You can see high, medium, low. And then the second part is to demonstrate the number of disadvantaged categories that are within the project area. So that's the part of the table to the left, 1 through 4. And staff structured the scoring this way to recognize the cumulative burdens that some communities face and allow communities with more burdens to have a higher scoring potential than communities who face far less. So we move on to the next slide. Just to help conceptualize this all, because I know it's a lot, we'll step through how a project would navigate this process. And this is the Cottage Grove Avenue Side Path project that was submitted by Fort Heights in the 2024 to 2028 program. So that was the last call for project cycle. And it was a cohort 4 community who was applying for preliminary engineering funding. So if we go on to the next slide, we have a quick video to just demonstrate how how an applicant would navigate the ETC tool. So Richard, if you want to go ahead and click play here. So the first thing a project applicant would do is use the filters at the top to select the state, in this case, Illinois. It also has a few other filtering options. And I know this is slightly hard to see, so bear with us a little bit. But so it zooms into the state, and then you can further filter down to the MPO level, in this case, CMAP. And we might have froze potentially. But I'll keep going here and hopefully it catches up. Oh, there we are. And then you can also filter then down by the community you're interested in or your project's located in. So in this case, it'd be Fort Heights. So we'll give it a minute to catch up here. And you can see that last filtering criteria for location is looking at Fort Heights. And then once that project location has been identified, the applicant would select that track that the project is located within. And once you click on that track, the data that you see to the right, so those 2 graphics, will update based off the data in that track. And then to answer that first question, the project would click over to the social vulnerability panel down in that bottom right portion, and it then produces all the data inputs that go into producing that overall category score. And you can hover over the different data sets to see what percentages they're at. And then at the top there, you can see those are all the 5 categories we mentioned that the ETC tool looks at. And then you can panel over again down below to see what data is included in those categories to get a better insights. And then the left panel that you see the cursor is over right now looking at on top of the map, that's just another panel that allows further information to be had about the project area, such as cost burden, access, and safety. So that's the tool and that's how the applicant would use it. And once they get that information, they'd then go on to fill out the prompts based off the information they find within here. So if we go ahead and move on to the next slide, if you are able to without stopping the video. There we are. So how would this project score? Again, we're talking about the Cottage Grove the side path in Fort Heights. For question 1, if they adequately identify disadvantaged population groups. As you can see, there are 4 or 5 there that are above, that are particularly high in that project area. So if they provided a high project response that staff considered high, they would receive the 4 circle below. And then for question 2, they identified they met 4 categories of disadvantage, which means they're able to score on that bottom line there where it's 4+. And if staff found their answer to be high, they would receive the 6 points for the question. And then you'd bring those 2 total scores together to have a total score. In this case, it'd be 10 out of the total 10 you can receive for the disadvantaged communities scoring section. So those are the dynamics of how this would get scored, as well as a quick example. We'll open it up for questions and see if you have thoughts. And Lee and I are happy to answer those or provide more context wherever there's needed.
Thanks, John and Lee. I think so. As we would like to bring this for approval, that we proceed with this. We realize that we're bringing this kind of on short notice. Normally, we would like to have an introductory period and then bring it back for a vote. But we're a little bit under the gun as far as time is concerned. Now, that being said, if the committee is not comfortable like voting today, we can just discuss it. But that would require us then to meet in September. I think our next scheduled meeting is September 12th. But that was only for the purposes if we had additional things that we needed to discuss for the call for projects. But with that, I would call for a motion to approve this change to the scoring criteria to include this to replace the DAC scoring that was done previously. So I have to bring it up on the floor. Like, I mean, we could just decide not to, and we would just open it up for discussion, but like, but then we would not be taking a vote today. Gotcha.
I'll make the motion. I think it's darn detailed.
Second.
All right, thank you. So now, do we have any questions or discussion on this?
Brush up on my parliamentary procedure next time.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you for a very informative presentation. My question is kind of anchoring, like dialing back even further. The subject of the memo is Justice 40 disadvantaged community scoring. So is this tool, the equitable transportation community tool, is this the new means of addressing the Justice 40 initiative? I feel like there's like 2 different things that are out there, and I'm just wondering like what the nexus is. Is this why we had to change where we are or what we're using?
So there's a few different tools. Like you are right that there are a few different ways of trying to figure this out. And so the big tools that the federal government is using right now, the first is called CJEST. I don't know that I can give you the acronym off the top of my head, Climate Environmental Justice something tool.
Right. I know I ended up looking it up on my phone because I was like, no, I thought there was, then there's another tool, but then we're using this one. So just curious about how we got to where we are now.
Yes. So the ETC tool is essentially a subset in a more detailed dive into the transportation related burdens and the burdens that can be addressed by transportation projects. And so what the DOT advises is that the ETC is used because it's essentially like a subset of the groups that would be identified by the larger tool, because CJEST includes some things that these types of projects really just wouldn't touch on as much, like I'm trying to give a good example off the top of my head now, like legacy pollution, for example, living near like a Superfund site. That's something that these types of projects aren't really addressing that. And so the ETC was created by the Department of Transportation to really hone in on those transportation related burdens. And so that's why the DOT is recommending using this. And just a note about Justice 40, it requires that 40% of the benefits go to places that are identified as low income and disadvantaged, which in the CMAP region is around a third to 40% of the region anyway. And so what we're able to do is essentially target within that 40%. We want to narrow into the people who are facing transportation related burdens. And so that's the logic in using ETC, is that it's a more narrowed subset and the types of burdens and benefits that these types of projects can really address.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Just one quick follow-up though, is out of curiosity, were there other tools that could have been used or that were considered? I mean, it sounds like this is just with the speed that the bill, the IIJA is being implemented, and I think these tools are just becoming more and more available for us to use. But just curious if this is an FHWA like suggestion that this is the tool which got us to where we are, or if there's other ones available. Thank you.
So we did consider using CGEST and decided to narrow into ETC because it has that transportation focus. And that is what the DOT guidance advises, is that CGEST is the broader net and then ETC narrows into that more specific subset.
And one thing we're also providing is if the applicant doesn't feel that the ETC is capturing the reality of their community, they're welcome to leverage other tools, but we want them to provide what tool they're using and why they are deciding to use that. And staff will assess that to see if we want to score it using another tool or not.
And we did that in the last round when we were using the DAC tool, because even by USDOT's assumption that it was not perfect. There were still some flaws that they were working through. And so we recognized that and gave the ability for applicants to provide why they thought like their project was still meeting the Justice 40 requirement if the DAC tool. So that's kind of what this is building on, like with providing applicants the ability to go, we don't agree with the tool and here's why, and then provide evidence of that staff will evaluate.
Yeah, it's good to do that because it is one of the great challenges of quantitative scoring.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, just a comment. I think this is a good approach and it seems reasonable. I think one thing I'm noticing is compared to the previous scoring, that was a little more exaggerated as you got up, and this one has a more linear approach. So it seems like any project is going to get a 1 on this, or maybe even a 2. Is that intentional, or is that maybe that's not true? But maybe it's not quite the case. Would something get a 0 possible? Yeah.
Yeah, so the only projects that would receive points are those that are considered disadvantaged, so they meet one of those categories within the tool. If a project that's located in a community that doesn't meet any of the categories, they would receive the 0. However, again, as I kind of mentioned with the tools, if they don't feel that's correct, they have an option to write in and explain why they think they should be considered for points.
Yeah, and I would just add that the disadvantaged population score, I think, adds a little bit of nuance too, because it then allows, even if the place is not experiencing those burdens, but there's maybe disadvantaged populations, like wanting to acknowledge that there's disadvantaged folks all throughout the region, even if you're living in a community that as an aggregate is not disadvantaged.
Thank you.
I would also like to add, and we will include contact information for applicants to reach out, especially communities that may have difficulty accessing this tool and applying it, so that we're not putting anybody at a burden, because it's not the simplest thing to do, but I mean, it is a web-based application, and we think that staff can provide help on that. So with that, are there any more questions or comments?
I thank you for that. I think that was part of my question, was how much has the project liaison folks been tied into this? What kind of support would there be? I noticed there's on the schedule, no webinar for the application, which I know we've done in the past. And I don't think this scoring criteria rises to the need for that, but just sort of curious in the background. I mean, this presentation's great for me to get an overview, but I don't think it certainly gives me a sense of understanding on how to actually apply this to a project. And you sort of answered that question for me. But I think the question that I think that I have that may be important, and I'm not sure it is. First off, you guys did a great job, John and Lee. And the first question, part one, on here in the portion that we got in our packet, it refers to located within the disadvantaged area or adjacent. And I've only been in this tool enough to zoom in on my house and see where I'm at on it and other locations. I haven't gone through that query and stuff like that. How is one to determine adjacent? I noticed it was absent from the slides, that specific word.
Yeah, so this is something where maybe a project termini goes beyond just one census tract. So if it's in multiple, so I think that's what we were getting at with the language of adjacent, is just thinking that we'll use all the census tracts to determine which, in the ETC tool, you can select the census tracts you want to look at and combine, and it'll bring up that data. It'll combine the data from all the census tracts. So that's what the adjacent means, is just like recognizing that it's going to go beyond sometimes a single census tract.
Okay.
And if Doug or Lee, feel free to expand on that if you like.
I would just add that mechanically, I think it's one of the big benefits of the ETC tool is that you can create custom geographies in a very user-friendly way. You actually just hold the shift key and then click on every census tract you want to select. And then all of that data on the right-hand side gets recalculated to match your exact geography, which is really great. A lot of tools, sometimes you can't do that without having to do your own complex statistical analysis.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
And getting to the first part of your question, we are planning to do some trainings with the planning liaisons, and we'll have guidance available for project applicants on how to use this tool. And then just making sure applicants know that the planning liaisons, as well as CMAP staff, are a resource to help.
Very cool. That's great to hear.
And did you have another question?
No, that's
Okay.
it. That's it.
Just
Thank you.
wanted to make sure.
No, it's perfect. Thank you.
All right. Good work. If there's no other questions, we do have a motion on the floor. Just last chance. All right, all those in favor of adding this new equity scoring to the criteria for the next call for projects, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, great, it passed. Moving on to other business, we don't have any other business, and so we'll move on to public comment. Is there anybody in the room that wishes to address the committee? I'm not seeing, is there anybody online who wishes to address the committee? Not seeing any, Kama, you? All right, thank you. As discussed a little earlier, our next meeting was scheduled for September 12th. We will not be holding that meeting. We will be canceling it. So next meeting will be November 7th of 2024. And with that, seeing as there's no other business, do I have a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
Thank you, Chris. Do I have a second? Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.